Welcome back to Face the Nation. We turn now to the case of Hoda Muthana, a 24-year-old woman born in New Jersey and raised in Alabama. In 2014, she joined ISIS and married an ISIS fighter. She now wants to return to the U.S. with her young son. But the Trump administration is refusing to grant that request. Her case will be heard tomorrow by a federal judge here in Washington. CBS News foreign correspondent Charlie D'Agata is in northern Syria, and he sat down with Hoda Muthana on Saturday.
Good morning. We met Hoda Muthana and her 18-month-old son Adam at a refugee camp that is now home for the foreseeable future. And the first she learned about the U.S. court hearing tomorrow that may decide her fate came from us.
Being so isolated here, do you have any idea the storm of controversy that's been kicked off in the United States over this case?
People have been telling me they've seen my case on TV, and everyone asks me, what are you going to do now? Where are you going to go next? I keep telling everyone that we're still trying to win the case, and hopefully we will. And I know I am an American citizen, and I know I have the right to come back. I have no other citizenship anywhere, even my own home country. I've never been there, never stepped foot out of America. So
there's no talk of like a Yemeni citizenship?
No.
You have no Yemeni citizenship?
No.
That's not even an option?
Mm-mm.
The President of the United States himself said that you're not welcome back to America. What would you say to him?
I would tell him to study the legal system because apparently I am allowed back. I have papers, I have citizenship, I have my dad's documents. It's apparent that he stopped working with the United Nations way before I was born.
Muthana says she handed her passport over to ISIS a month after she crossed into Syria from Turkey in November 2014. She surrendered to U.S.-led coalition forces in January in the dying days of ISIS. She insists she would have left sooner, but could never raise enough money to pay smugglers.
$6,000.
Yeah.
$6,000.
Mm-hmm. And there was no way I can get that type of money. So we were held hostage there basically, and the only way to leave was to go through a field of IEDs or snipers from ISIS shooting at you, or if you do get caught, which I got caught twice and I was very scared. I got caught twice by them. And in one situation, I actually broke my phone and ran away.
Yet, for a time, she apparently embraced the darkest beliefs of ISIS, allegedly taking to social media to incite attacks on Americans. Her lawyer has advised her not to comment about that.
I ruined my life. I ruined it. Well, no.
You had,
I ruined my son's future, but I wouldn't have had a son if I didn't come. That's the only regret I don't have.
Now, she and other Western ISIS families had to be transferred there from another camp because of death threats from ISIS hardliners. And hers is not an isolated case. She said she knew of maybe a handful of other Americans there, but officials say they will not comment on individual nationalities. Margaret?
That's our Charlie D'Agata in Syria. We're now joined by Alabama's Democratic Senator Doug Jones. He's also the author of a new book, Bending Towards Justice, the Birmingham church bombing that changed the course of civil rights. Senator, I want to ask you about the book, but first let's talk about this young woman because She is from Alabama. Yep. Have you spoken to the White House about her case?
No, I have not. Her citizenship is tied up with the State Department right now. They'll have that hearing on that. But no one is going to welcome this person back to the United States. That's just a mischaracterization. I do think we ought to consider bringing her back to face justice. We do it all the time with terrorists, with other people that commit crimes against the United States. I think it sends a kind of a bad message if we give someone a get-out-of-jail-free card just because they go to the Middle East.
Secretary Pompeo claims she has no basis to claim U.S. citizenship, but she did have a U.S. passport.
She did. I think that's going to be decided in the courts and within the State Department. My concern is just the message that we're sending by not bringing someone back to face American justice. I have an abiding faith. I'm an old federal prosecutor myself, and I have this faith in our system of justice to do the right thing, to make sure that justice is imposed, and I think that's what we ought to be looking at here.
Well, you talked about your time as a prosecutor. You famously prosecuted KKK members, those involved in that 1963 horrific bombing of a church that killed 4 little girls. It took decades for the FBI to release any of the evidence they had gathered against the killers.
Right.
From your experience, do you think digging into history, painful history like this, aggravates tensions, or is it necessary?
Oh, I think it's absolutely necessary. What we saw after those cases, there was such a sense of healing. I mean, there are still a lot of open wounds for those civil rights cases because people don't know the answers. They don't know why. They don't know the who. And I think we can look back at ourselves and at a painful time in our history, and we can learn from those mistakes. So I think it's even more important today. We see hateful rhetoric all over the country these days, and it's not just black and white anymore. It's religion, it's nationality, it's gender, you name it. We see that, and I think to go back and look at that history to make sure we don't commit the same mistakes that we did the last time, I think it's very important, and it's a sense of healing for the community and for those families.
You talk in the book about backsliding. That's the phrase you use.
Yep.
Particularly on the voting rights of minorities these days. Who do you blame for that?
Well, I think it's a combination of things. I mean, I think that we've had some losses in the courts, but I also think it's a political power grab right now where people are trying to gerrymander districts, where people are trying to prevent people to the right to vote, give them free access to the vote. We need to be expanding the voter rolls and trying to get people to the vote. We need to be pushing the percentage of Americans up who want to vote on Election Day. And instead, we seem to be working, and the powers that be seem to be constricting that. And I think we've got to change that. There's a new bill pending right now, introduced last week on the voter enhancement, try to put some teeth back in the Voting Rights Act.
Who do you blame for this?
Well, I think if you look at carefully, you have to look at the state legislatures, governors, and members of Congress that are Republicans. For whatever reason, they do not want African Americans and other minorities to vote. I assume rather than trying to get those votes, they seem to want to restrict those votes. And I think that that's incredibly unfortunate. We need to have more dialogues in this country rather than monologues, and then we can do it about Voting Rights Act. We talk a good game about everybody having a right to vote and a duty to vote. But at the end of the day, we seem to be working to try to restrict that, and that's just wrong.
Just yesterday, we learned what was going to happen to those 2 Sacramento police officers involved in the shooting of a man named Stephon Clark. He was about 22 years old, shot in his grandmother's backyard. They thought he was armed. Turned out it was just a cell phone. It turns out he had faced some accusations of domestic abuse, other things. But what do you make of this case? Because for many, they see this as an example of a criminal justice system that is unfairly treating and just rigged against African Americans.
Well, and to some extent, I think that there's some truth to that. I mean, historically, over the last 30, 40 years, especially with the crack cocaine epidemic, we've seen all manner of things where the people of color have been incarcerated on larger scales than those that are not. And I think we took a First Step Act that we passed in Congress this past year, passed Congress, with criminal justice reform, with the president's approval, with the support of the administration. I think that is going to go to correct it. But it is very difficult when you have tensions between law enforcement and any minority community. And that's very difficult to do. Law enforcement officers have to make split-second decisions, but at the same time, there's got to be some way to hold people accountable, even if they make the wrong decision at the wrong time.
You mentioned the First Step Act, which you supported. That was
Absolutely.
a Trump administration initiative. I mean, you're in this unusual position of being from a very red state. I think you're the first Democrat elected to the Senate from Alabama in
Since 1992.
25 years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. You're up for re-election in 2020. You're getting targeted this seat for Republicans to flip it back. How do you convince people in your home state to not make you the first in 25 years and the last?
Well, all I do is do my job. I have the people of Alabama's best interests at heart. I am an independent voice for them. I'm not a solid voice or vote for the president or the Democratic Party. I look at each individual vote separately, and I try to do the right thing. I think some of the best compliments I've had in the last year, in my 1 year in the Senate, was when I'd go home and people say, well, Doug, you're doing exactly what you said you would do, and that's looking out for us. And we have a lot of issues that we face. But, I think Alabama, the South, we're all changing. There's a lot of things going on. We're putting aside a lot of the issues that have divided us in the past, that have caused some of those incredible divisions, political and social divisions. Right now, we're talking about jobs. We're talking about health care. That's a driving force in my state. Education, workforce development. Those are the things we have in common, and that's what I'm going to keep preaching. And then we'll see how it goes. I feel very good about where we are.
Senator, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.
We'll be back in a moment with our political panel. We turn now to our panel for some political analysis. Jeffrey Goldberg is the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. Paula Reed covers the Justice Department as well as the White House for CBS. David Sanger is a national security correspondent and senior writer for the New York Times. And David Nakamura covers the White House for the Washington Post. So I know you guys aren't over your jet lag, because I certainly am not, having covered this summit in Hanoi. David, you have a piece, an extensive one, in the New York Times today, writing about what went wrong with these talks. You heard the National Security Advisor give his take. What is the bottom line?
Well, I think the bottom line, Margaret, is that they sent the President of the United States halfway around the world into a negotiation that had not been not only not pre-cooked, but basically they had nothing when he landed. Usually the way summits work, for all of us who've gone and covered these, is the president comes in as the closer on the final 10%. What was clear here was that this was not just the get-to-know-you meeting that happened in Singapore. This was a meeting that was intended to go work out a schedule for the denuclearization. And if you couldn't get that, then at least stop the problem from getting worse.
They couldn't even agree on the definition of denuclearization.
They could not. And Kim came in with a offer which had been made in various forms over the past 3 presidencies to go sort of have a moratorium on some kind of production at Yongbyon, which is their main nuclear center. There was some remarkable interchanges. You heard a little bit of it when you asked Mr. Bolton about it. There are sites outside of Yongbyon that are still producing nuclear material. The president correctly, I think, wanted to get everything shut down. But he left not even getting a suspension of additional production, which means that while this drags on, the North Korean problem's getting worse. They have 30 weapons already. They'll probably have more. Also, just the scene of what we were going through, I mean, this was taking place in the Metropole Hotel, this old French colonial hotel, a century old. Feet from where the president and Kim were meeting is a bomb shelter that was used to herd guests into when the Americans were bombing North Vietnam. So this whole scene of working out one last Cold War problem on the site where Ho Chi Minh and others plotted against the Americans and the French was pretty remarkable.
There were so many remarkable moments, and we saw one of them in that piece earlier. But David, we have to point out, you were the reporter who had the guts to throw the very first question to Kim Jong-un, and he answered it.
He answered.
It was astounding.
Shouting a question to the most brutal dictator in the world. What could go wrong, right? Luckily, I'm back here to talk about it, luckily, fortunately. No, we didn't know what would happen. I mean, there's a small group of White House reporters that are allowed into these photo ops. People often shout at President Trump. Sometimes the answers. The day before, he had gotten irritated by some shouted questions. But we wanted to engage Kim Jong-un. This was one of the few chances. Even if they had gotten a deal, he would not have appeared at a news conference. So we did ask him. I asked him whether he was confident he would get a deal. He said he was, at the moment, too early to tell. He was right. And he said he was not pessimistic. He was hopeful. But we saw just hours later, I was there in the dining room for lunch. The press corps was let in, and we said the lunch would start around noon. Half an hour later, they still hadn't happened. And we realized that this thing had gone off the rails and things were not going well. And sure enough, within about 5 minutes of that, we were told plans had changed. We were led back to the press hold, and then they canceled the lunch and any signing ceremony, so there was no deal.
And we should point out, that's not just your analysis. That was actually on a public schedule, that there was a signing ceremony. So it would be understating things, Jeff, to say this disappointed, even though John Bolton said it was not.
Yeah, John Bolton did an admirable job of masking his own obvious feelings regarding this summit. Yeah, I mean, I would just issue one corrective to David's excellent summary, David Sanger's excellent summary. He talked about they brought the president halfway around the world. The president brought himself halfway around the world. Nobody really thought that this was going to work. This was not pre-cooked. That would be a vernacular way of describing how summits are made. But you're exactly right. You're supposed to bring the president in to sign the document, to maybe argue a little bit. But this was another thing entirely, and this is the downside of an entirely spontaneous presidency and a president who doesn't actually listen. It acknowledges that he doesn't listen to his own intelligence chiefs when they tell him this is not going to work, this is not going to work, and so on. And so the outcome, it was bizarre scene, but this was predictable, utterly predictable.
It shows the limits of the president's strategy here was, he said, look, we have 30 years of negotiations at the lower level. We never got to a presidential summit. Let's flip it around, take more risk, start top down. But, this is something where the president felt his personal relationship with Kim Jong-un, whatever that is, No one's really sure what that is, but he thinks it's good, and that would be the closing. That would make the deal happen. It's not going to work.
And he may have over-personalized it in that regard, because he's showing people these letters from Kim Jong-un as if I have a rapport with him, I'll be able to make this deal.
Paula, the other personal relationship the president had that we heard a lot about this week was with his former attorney, Michael Cohen, who was testifying while these negotiations are happening. And the president actually acknowledged, despite the 12-hour time difference, that he watched the testimony.
Absolutely. And the timing was deliberate. This is an effort to undermine the president and lay out a roadmap for House Democrats to now pursue various investigations. The most important thing we learned from this hearing is that the president's legal problems have metastasized far beyond the special counsel investigation. And what he should be most concerned about is what is going on in the Southern District of New York, where federal prosecutors, we knew they were looking into campaign finance violations. They have several cooperating witnesses who implicate the president in directing this scheme to violate campaign finance laws. But now we've also learned there are other investigations that we still don't know about, in addition to the fact that they're looking into the president's last conversation with Michael Cohen. He couldn't even discuss what the two men talked about because that is the subject of an ongoing investigation, raising questions about possible obstruction or even witness tampering.
And the Judiciary Committee chairman in the House said today, for him, all this amounts to obstruction of justice. And in fact, I think he's calling about 60 different individuals to try to come testify. Where does this go next?
We are going to really shift the focus from the special counsel. Everyone's going to be on high alert once again for that final report. But what's going on in Manhattan, that's what's really going to matter. Those crimes are also probably more easy to prove since you have cooperating witnesses. And oftentimes they may not be the sexiest crimes, right? Possible tax fraud or insurance fraud, but they're much easier to prove because they're paperwork crimes. On a parallel track, House Democrats are going to go full steam ahead, calling all of these witnesses and continuing to seek corroborating documents for what Michael Cohen said, seeing if they can sort of, confirm his story. But so far, it appears that the special counsel's report may not come for a few more weeks.
And we heard from Adam Schiff, the chairman of House Intelligence, this allegation of money laundering on behalf of Russia through the Trump Organization, but he admitted he had no proof of that thus far.
That's a pretty big bomb to lob without any corroboration. I also take issue with his claim that he has evidence of collusion. He seemed to be conflating contact with collusion. He says what happened at Trump Tower was collusion. He's pointing to emails. Nothing was exchanged there. Same with the meeting that Paul Manafort had with Konstantin Kilimnik, exchanging polling data. We know there was contact. We know that, but we don't know what they did with that polling data. So we certainly have evidence of contact, but a criminal conspiracy, so far, there has not been sufficient proof for anyone to be charged in that.
We're going to take a really quick break and come back in just a moment. We're back now with our political panel. David Nakamura, I want to ask you about the president's speech, the longest of his presidency, just yesterday at CPAC. A lot of different headlines in there.
A lot of different headlines.
Yeah, but for you, I mean, what stood out? What was the purpose in this almost 2-hour-long speech?
I mean, it seemed like, a greatest hits. He went through a lot of things that he's talked about before and, of course, demonized the investigations into his campaign conduct and so on. And but what struck me was the length of this event, but also the setting of the event, with a crowd that really does seem to genuinely support the president and really love the president. Seemed like he was coming back from a summit that had collapsed. He had a hearing of Michael Cohen when he was out of the country, and it was hard for him to sort of, come back like he'd like to do in real time. And now he had a lot to get off his chest. And so, he went through bit by bit all the folks who he felt as a threat to him, and does what he does, which is attack.
It was a greatest hits compilation, and I was thinking, watching it, he had been so buttoned up, comparatively speaking, in Hanoi. You have to hit your marks, you have to say certain things, and he's not disciplined in that way. He gets in front of a home audience, a home field advantage, and everything pours out. All the repressed observations that he wanted to make.
Including profanity.
Including profanity, including everything. It was the longest speech in presidential history, if you actually want to call it a speech. I don't know if technically it counts as a speech in terms of its organization, but it was, we believe, the longest public speaking event of a president in history.
The other oddity was, here was a president who we thought might be using Hanoi as a way to divert from the Cohen testimony. And then he shows up basically having to divert from the fact that he had come back from Hanoi with nothing against, a tiny country that, has a fraction of the power of the United States. So he is, as David says, back to his greatest.
It took him about 1 hour and 50 minutes even to get to North Korea, if I'm not mistaken, in the speech.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But it's interesting, David, because the Washington Post has a headline today saying the acquiescence to Trump is now the GOP's defining trait. I mean, is that how you read that speech yesterday before CPAC?
Well, I think one of the remarkable things about the Republican Party is that in the run-up to the election, you saw all these people trying to separate themselves from President Trump. And now they've determined he's their candidate for the next election, so they have to line themselves up. And I think the long historical question here is the Republican Party going to be, over the long term, more like the party that President Trump has defined, or more like the traditional Republicans that President Trump defeated for the nomination? And I don't think they've really decided internally within the party the answer to that. And I think much of it depends on how the investigation turns out.
And Paula, you're seeing Republicans line up behind the president in defending him against these investigations as well. I mean, you have Kevin McCarthy, the Republican leader, out there on the attack against Adam Schiff, who's leading the House Intelligence.
And look at the Cohen hearing, right? Everyone else was seeming to audition for that role of fixer. Republicans weren't able to really, except for one exception, grill him on the substance of his allegations, many of which were extremely damning. Instead, they just went after his credibility, sort of doing what Cohen used to do for the president.
Jeff, switching gears a bit, but perhaps not thematically. At this presidential...
I'm curious now.
the president's press conference in Hanoi, he was asked about a number of things, a number of topics, including what's happening in Israel right now. And his friend, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, indicted. Typically, ahead of an election, an American president would say, I don't want to wade in.
Yeah.
President jumped in.
President jumped in. Netanyahu has become, like many foreign leaders, more Trumpian as he's watched this new model of leadership. And I think President Trump is quite nervous about watching what would happen to a prime minister of an allied country under indictment. We are facing an interesting moment. Netanyahu's been prime minister for a decade. In this just a second run, he might be through. That's not good news for Donald Trump. It's not good news for his party. The thing about Netanyahu, one of the many similarities they have is do not count either man out. Do not count Netanyahu out yet.
We'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thank you for watching. We'll see you next week. For Face the Nation, I'm Margaret Brennan.